Hey everybody, Wonder Always Bored, Never Boring. As subscribers to my channel will know, I'm a big fan of Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress, but I've never done, or I never got around to doing a review, or a video review, or a playthrough, or anything like that. But I've had a few requests in the past to take a bit more of a detailed look at it and how it plays. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to take a quick overview of the game, how it works, and anything of particular note for anybody who might be interested in picking it up. So the first thing to be aware of is that the game comes with quite a lot of books, quite a lot of paperwork. It may seem a little bit daunting to begin with. You get your build instructions. Obviously that's to put your miniatures together. Miniatures do require assembly. They are push fit. They go together without glue. So that is worth knowing. If you're not keen on the assembly idea, these do go together relatively easily. I still glued mine because I still think it's better to glue them even when they are push fit, but you do not technically have to. This here is the data sheets. Now this isn't actually for Blackstone Fortress, but what this is rules for using all of your Blackstone Fortress miniatures in 40k. Very nice to have, but not something you need to worry about. Then we have this background book. This is very nice. It's got all kinds of information in there. Lovely artwork. Stuff about what Blackstone Fortress is and some background information on our heroes, or our adventurers they call them, because they're not technically heroes. The background book, again, you don't need to read it to play, but I do think one of the strongest things of Blackstone Fortress is the theme and the narrative, because basically the Blackstone Fortress is this monolithic space station that it's been lost in the midst of time as to how it came to be, but it's been discovered and it's full of old, ancient, valuable tech. So adventurers go there and they've set up a space station called Precipice where the adventurers can dock, and it's a completely neutral place. You're not allowed to get into fights and things like that, or you get in a lot of trouble with the locals. But from Precipice, you launch your expeditions into the Blackstone Fortress in search of valuable tech. And the game, it comes with a campaign, which is an exploration where you launch expeditions to gather clues in order to break into 4 strongholds and find some valuable goodies. If you don't want to play through that campaign, there are rules for standalone adventures, but really it's a campaign driven game. You want to play through those narratives, and each expansion that they've released, the 2 expansions are Traitor Command and the Dreaded Amble. Both of those big box expansions add a new mission that you go off to and explore that mission separately from the mission in the base game. Then we have 3 rules books, and this I know has caused some confusion in the past. I hear a lot of people complaining about the rule books because you have one book called Rules, one book called Combat, and one book called Precipice. And people, I've seen people complain that some of the rules that you need in combat are actually in this book, and some of the rules that you might... Basically, the rules aren't as clearly cut as this is your base game rules, these are rules specifically for combat, and these are rules specifically for Precipice. Because that's kind of a misconception of how these books work. They haven't divided the game up into its sections, they have divided the game up into the installments in which you're going to first experience those sections. So you read the rules book, it says read this first. That gets you started. This rules book will cover setting up the game and going on your first expedition, and it will cover all of the basic rules for how to launch an expedition, build your party, and deal with things like that. When you get to your first combat situation, then you read the combat book, and then that's got additional rules that are required specifically for the combat situation. But the book itself is still used in conjunction with these rules. It's an extra layer. It's like a cake. And then when you finish your expedition and return to Precipice, then you read these rules. And again, it's another layer on the cake. It's not something that you don't treat it in complete isolation. You may still need to refer back to this book as well. So that's the way they've done it. They've broken it down into installments in which you're going to actually have those experiences. But don't expect it to be the case that when you're in a combat situation, you won't need to refer to any of the other books, because you will. But anyway, let's set up a game and have a look at that. So the game of Blackstone Fortress is divided up into a series of expeditions, and the start of each expedition is the same. You have to compose your party and then arrange the various cards and things you will need for that particular expedition. So let's take a quick look at the hero party composition. First of all, you have to allocate a leader. This is quite fun. Look, there's a leader token. It's got an Auspex on it. I quite like that. It's a nice little nod back to Warhammer Quest when the leader player was determined by the lantern token. It's kind of like the futuristic version of that, being able to see in the darkness what is coming up. I do quite like that. But anyway, so that's your leader token. And then each player will get a hero. Here's Janus Drake. We're going to take a look at Janus Drake in detail in a moment. The game of Blackstone Fortress always uses 4 heroes. This is something to be aware of if you're one of those people that only likes to control a single hero. In this game, even if you play solo, you have to control 4 heroes. Normally that's not something I'm that keen on, but in this game it does seem to work quite well, because the heroes don't feel so much like individual heroic characters when you're using them. They do feel like more like a military unit that works together using their skills together. It's very difficult to explain, but it does feel more like you're advancing a unit, a 40k unit, into the midst of enemy territory to work together to achieve an objective, and you're like a commander overseeing their operation rather than investing yourself into a single character. And the way that the game is set up does reinforce that, because at the start of each expedition you can change the heroes that you're controlling. The heroes that were on the previous expedition just sit this mission out, and different heroes come in. And if a hero dies, then you have to bring in a different hero to replace them. And furthermore, the same players don't have to always control the same characters. So for this game I might be Janus Drake, but then I may say, well, okay, well in the next game I'd like to bring a different player in, and a different character in, and someone could say, well, I quite fancy playing as Janus Drake, and they can take over Janus Drake for me for a while. Furthermore, if there's a 5th player in your team, then one player has to take on the control of the enemies as you go on the expedition. They will deal with moving the enemy units and making their decisions and things based on the rules that are defined for how enemies act. And again, that's quite interesting, because what you can do is you can allocate your 5th player a character, and then if the character is on that particular mission, then they can play as their character, and if you have to drop that character and bring a different character in, then they can play as the villains. And you can keep switching out who's controlling the villains, so everyone gets an opportunity to do that. Everybody gets a chance to be a hero. There's no one versus many, oh gosh, I always have to be the overlord type situation. It's a very fluid way to build a party. So this is Janus Drake. He's kind of like the poster boy for the game. He's kind of like the leader, for want of a better term. He's a rogue trader. It says so there. The way the cards are laid out, you have the name at the top and their profession. You then have the ship that they came in on, because remember, Precipice is a deep space station that you have to get to by ship. So Janus came on board the Vanguard, and the Vanguard is now docked at Precipice, and between expeditions he can return to Vanguard and maybe trade with people there and do other things. We have some stats. Move, obviously the number of spaces you move on the board on your turn when you take a move action, and then you get defense, agility, and vitality, which are 3 stats that get tested at various points for different reasons. And you will see that there's a little triangle against each one, and that means that when you test against those abilities, you roll the triangle dice. We will look at the dice in a moment. We then have 4 boxes. These are our action dice boxes, because when you have your turn in the game, you roll action dice. They're just regular d6, like so. And then you place your action dice on your character. And those dice determine what you can do on your turn. Everybody has access to some basic abilities like moving. You can expel a dice of value 1 or more to move up to your move value. And then everybody also gets special weapon actions on their cards, which all require different numbers to activate. And everybody gets special rules and special abilities, which again may require dice to activate them. And there's a whole host of different options like exploring and things like that, all of which you require a dice of the relevant value. If you don't have a dice of that value, you cannot perform that action. For example, here, Janus has got 2 weapon actions that he can take. At any time, he can expel a dice with a value 1 or more to make a pistol and rapier attack. And when he does that, you refer to the range from the enemy, and then you roll the relevant dice. So we can see that if the enemy is 1 space away, he will roll the triangle dice. If it's 2 or 3 spaces away, he will roll the triangle dice. If it's 4 spaces away, he rolls the regular 6-sided dice. And then he also has a flurry of attacks action, which he can either use with a 4+ dice or a 6+ dice. And if he uses a 4+ dice, he gets one particular set of actions, and if he uses the 6+ dice, he gets a bonus, because obviously expelling a dice with a higher value rewards you with greater benefits. And then everybody gets special rules, and everybody has something called a secret agenda. A secret agenda is a particular mission it's specific to your hero. Everybody has the overarching mission to achieve, going in and completing those expeditions in order to access those strongholds and get the loot. But everybody also has a secret agenda, and if you achieve your secret agenda or you become inspired in some way, then you can flip your character card over to the inspired side, which I feel is kind of an idea that they lifted from their Underworlds skirmish game, where characters can inspire when certain things happen. And then your stats change and you get better statistics. He becomes more agile, and he gets better attack values with his weapons. So, what's the deal with the dice then? There are 3 types of dice representing degrees of goodness. This is the weakest dice, the 6-sided dice, and you'll see that it has 4 blank sides, it has a triangle on one side, and it has 2 triangles on another side. And then we have the 8-sided dice. This is the one represented by the triangle on the charts, and you can see we've got one triangle there, 2 triangles there, 1 triangle there, 2 triangles there. So much better chance of getting a good result with that one. And then here we go. We have the 12-sided dice, which has got all stuff everywhere. When you take an action, you roll whichever dice it tells you to roll, and you may have to roll multiple dice, and you may have to roll dice of different sorts. But what you always do is you always take your best result. It doesn't matter how many dice you're rolling, you only pick one result, and it's your best result that you want to apply. A triangle represents a success. 2 triangles represents a critical success, which usually gives you a bonus. So that's that. You roll your dice. I've rolled 1s there, so I could pick either of those, it doesn't matter which, and I apply a success. A blank is obviously a failure. And that's how the dice system works. So you've got, basically for each character, you've got 2 types of dice you need to be aware of. You have your activation dice, which you use to activate your abilities, and you have your resolution dice, which determine the success level of your actions. Once you have determined the members of your party, you are ready to set up the precipice board. Here is the precipice board. It's a single board representing the thriving little spaceport, and it has several sections on it which are relevant as you play the game. First and foremost, we have spaces here for something called destiny dice. Destiny dice are basically extra activation dice. When you're in combat situations, you may have access to additional dice which you spend in exactly the same way as your own activation dice, just as a way to get bonus actions. And then as they are used, they are moved over to here. The second thing you have to do is put out the spaceships that are related to your adventurers. As I mentioned before, each adventurer has access to their own particular spacecraft. A couple of the adventurers came on the same ships, but for each adventurer that is going on the expedition, you put out the associated spacecraft. You put them out like this because they are docked around the edge of Precipice. Now, the spaceships are interesting for two reasons. One, as you can see at the moment, they are showing their support side. And that's because when you go on the expedition, at any point, you have access to the support special ability on the spaceships. These are powerful one-use activations. They usually do cool stuff. They can get you out of a jam if you're about to come a cropper in the middle of an expedition. But once you have used a ship's ability, it is gone for the rest of the expedition until you return to Precipice. So picking your adventurers not only determines what heroes are going into the Blackstone Fortress, it not only determines what activations and what special abilities you're going to have access to while you're in the dungeon, they also define which support actions are going to be available to you, so that it's an extra thing to think about. It's like you may like two particular characters, but if they're coming from ships that aren't going to be giving you the abilities that you think you're going to need, you may want to rethink that strategy. So it's quite an interesting little thing. The other side of the spaceships, there is a facilities side, and that's for when you visit Precipice after an expedition. So for now, you put it with the support side face up. This space in the middle of the board is for the exploration cards, and you get a big wedge of exploration cards in the base set, and you get extra ones with each expansion that you buy. And they fall into two categories. You have combat cards and challenge cards. Combat cards represent a skirmish where you will confront enemies and you set up a board and you have a miniatures based tabletop skirmish. Something that you would expect in any dungeon crawler. You put out tiles, you move around, and you roll your dice and you do your attacking and things like that. The challenge cards, they're more narrative driven. They're a one-off occurrence of something that happens. You read through the card, you follow the instructions, and then once you've resolved it, you move on. And the way that an expedition works, a basic expedition, is you draw 4 combat cards at random and 4 challenge cards at random. You shuffle them together and you pop them there. And that will be your exploration deck for this particular expedition that you're going on. And as you go in to your expedition, you flip the exploration cards one by one and resolve them. And your expedition ends when you get to the end of that deck of 8 cards, or you choose to retire back to Precipice because you're getting quite badly beaten up by the monsters in the Blackstone Fortress. The final space, this one here, is for the Discovery deck. And the Discovery deck is unique to the campaign you are playing. So if you're playing the campaign from the base game, you use this stack of base game Discovery cards. If you're playing one of the expeditions, you use the Discovery cards that come with that expansion. And the Discovery cards are mainly archaeotech. It's cash, it's loot. It's the stuff that you will spend when you go back to Precipice. However, in amongst the cards, there are a few extra bonus goodies, things that might activate a character's inspiration so they're more powerful, and Discovery cards are specifically related to your mission. Like say in the base game, the mission is to locate clues. Once you have clues, you can access strongholds, and accessing the strongholds is how you win the game. So these are the Discovery cards you want. And I think the Discovery deck is a pretty interesting concept because it's where you get your loot, it's where you can get the special things that cause particular characters to inspire, and it's also where you get those clue tokens. So when you acquire the loot, when you acquire the archaeotech, that's cash and you hold on to it. When you return to Precipice, you can spend it. If you spend it though, it goes back into the Discovery deck, and therefore it makes it harder to find the clue tokens. So there's a really interesting balancing mechanism there. It's like, how long do you want to hold on to your money for so that you can thin the Discovery deck and find the clue tokens you need? Or how quickly do you want to spend that archaeotech to make your characters better, to make them stronger. It's a fine line because the whole game, as we will learn, it's a time challenge. You only have a specific amount of time to find all the clue tokens you need to get into those strongholds, and if you run out of time, it's game over. So you want the discovery deck to be as thin as possible. You want to be able to find those clue tokens every time you're drawing discovery cards. But to do that, you have to hold on to the Archaeotech, and then you're not upgrading your characters, you're not leveling up. Because leveling up in this game is not done through stat boosts, it's done through equipment, buying better equipment. When you have better equipment, you're more powerful when you use that equipment, and a lot of the equipment is single use. You use it and then it's discarded, which it's one of my favourite kind of items actually, is items that you use them and then they're gone, or they're one use for that particular expedition, that combat, because it makes an interesting decision point. It's something to worry about. You're not just like permanently getting a stat bonus, you are using it and losing it, and then you've got to find it again, you've got to acquire it again, or you acquire something different which makes you better in a different way. And that's more interesting, it's more fluid, it's more dynamic, and it's exactly the kind of thing that I like. At this point we are almost ready to go on our expedition, but before we do, we have to set up the combat tracker, and this is a very nifty little device that keeps track of which monsters are in a fight and the order in which they are operating. So we put the tracker out, and then we find two sets of initiative cards. One set of initiative cards is just numbered 1 to 4, and they're for the hostile groups, which we will explain momentarily. They just go there for now. And then we have to find 4 initiative cards for the heroes that are going on the adventure. And those go there. And then finally, we have to sort out which encounter cards we're going to need for this particular adventure. If this is your very first time playing, then you will only have Traitor Guardsman cards, quite a few of those, Negavolt Cultists, Urgles, and Spindle Drones. And that's because this game has something that they refer to as legacy, but it's not really legacy. It's not legacy as people tend to think of legacy as sticking stickers on things and ripping cards up and that sort of stuff. It's not that, but as you play the game, you will add cards to a timer mechanism, and every time you add cards, there's a potential for new monsters to get added to the dungeon, tougher, stronger monsters, and when that happens, you add the relevant cards to the encounter deck, and then there's a risk that you're going to bump into those bigger, stronger monsters when you have a fight. So it's a really nifty way of ramping up the pressure. If you again, it's down to balancing. You're against the clock, because if the clock runs out, you lose, but also as the clock advances, your enemies are getting tougher. So you want to hang around building up your Archaeotech so you can buy better equipment, but you don't want to hang around too long, because otherwise any new equipment you've got is negated by the fact that you're coming up against stronger bad guys. It's just pretty cool. It's just a nifty little mechanism. But anyway, that's ready to go. At this point, you're probably thinking, that's a lot of setup for an expedition. And it does seem like quite a lot, but once you know what you're doing, it's relatively straightforward to do. It doesn't take more than a few minutes. And once you get to this stage, you are in fact ready to begin your expedition. I have put out the Maglev transporter, and I have assembled my party on it. You can see there's up to 2 characters can go on any space, so they are ready to go. And at this point, we start going through the exploration phases. And the structure of the game really couldn't be any simpler. The game plays out over a number of exploration rounds, which determines how your expedition turns out. In each exploration round, you start by drawing an exploration card and resolving it. Then there is a recovery step where heroes may die or may recover wounds. And then there is a leader step where you pass the leader token on to the next player to the left. So the exploration step, you draw the top exploration card, the leader draws the top exploration card. If it's a challenge, you resolve the challenge as it's written. If it's a combat, then you set up the board and you play your miniature skirmish combat. After that, like I say, there is the recovery step. If any of your heroes were taken out of action, and we'll talk about that when we talk about combat, then you have to make a recovery roll. You basically roll the dice. If you roll equal to or less than the number of grievous wounds your character has, your character dies, and that means it's the end of the expedition. Everybody goes back to Precipice. That character is dead for the rest of your campaign, so you have to bring on a new hero to replace them on your roster. from the 8 available heroes. And then you have to set up a new expedition and go again. If you roll greater than the number of grievous wounds you have, then you come back into action and you can carry on. A vitality roll, basically, you roll the dice that's equal to your vitality rating on your character card. If you get a success, you can recover 1 wound. If you get a critical success, you can recover 2 wounds. And that's how you can keep going. And then, like I say, there's a leader phase, you pass a leader token on, and you carry on. Of course, one of the most interesting things that can happen is a combat. I like the challenge cards, or I like the idea of the challenge cards. I've talked about this in other videos. They're more like a narrative thing. It's just like a little bit of text that tells you something's happening, and then you resolve it, usually with a test or a few dice rolls or a little mini game. And it's a really interesting idea because it allows them to deal with things that you can't condense into a tabletop board game. You can have your heroes go into locations that represent the vastness of the Blackstone Fortress, which you wouldn't be able to do with a few tiles on the board. You can have them meeting creatures that are completely unimaginable and wouldn't be able to be turned into a miniature. You've got all these different things, and you can weave a narrative. I don't think yet Games Workshop has really taken full advantage of that potential in those challenge cards. They're quite fun, and they're a little mild diversion from having to just do combats all the time, but I think there's a lot of scope with those to make something a little bit more interesting and something that really drills into the narrative of the Blackstone Fortress and what it's all about. But for now, they're just like little vignettes. They're little moments that something fun might happen, or something bad might happen to you, or you might get a reward, or you might get stitched up. You might have to have a little ambush or something. There's lots of little things that can happen that just it fleshes out slightly the narrative of the Blackstone Fortress beyond just constant combats all the time. But for most people, the big draw is going to be setting up your tiles and having your combat encounter. So what happens is when you have a combat encounter, you will get an exploration card that looks something like this, and it has a map on it. And you have to set up your map. And the map will always have the entry point, the maglev, which is where you guys are at the time, because you're on like these lifts that go up and down and whoosh you around inside the Blackstone Fortress. And then you have to set up this map. This is one of my biggest complaints with the game, because the maps aren't numbered, the tiles aren't numbered, and the tiles are double-sided. So it can actually take quite a bit of time to set up your board in order to actually have the combat. Let's set up a board. Our battlefield is ready to be populated with enemies, but before we do that, a few interesting things to note on the board. First of all, we have white lines. White lines represent cover. You can move through them, but if you shoot across them, then your target receives a bonus, and it's much more difficult to kill things. We have hexes with red edges, which are very difficult for me to see, but the red edges are blocking terrain. You cannot move through those. And finally, you will notice there are some tokens on the board. In this particular map, there are 3 tokens, but there can be up to 4. Those are discovery tokens, and they show you where minions will start, where monsters will start from, and also have an effect later on for searching as well. So the final thing to do before we can start fighting is actually figure out what we're up against. So here we have our handy combat tracker, which is going to keep track of the enemies that we're going to be facing. And this particular battlefield has 3 discovery tokens on it, so we're going to draw 3 encounter cards, one at a time. This is our first encounter card. As you can see, it's got 4 numbers on it, but we are drawing for discovery counter 1, so we only have to look at point 1. It says 7 traitor guardsmen, so we know that 7 traitor guardsmen are going to spawn at that first discovery point. And then we put that there as a reminder that that group is related to that discovery token. We then do the same thing again, and our second card, we're now looking at discovery point 2. And we can see it's 5 traitor guardsmen. So that goes there, like so. We then draw our third card, and in this case, we don't get an enemy at all, we get an event, Blackout. The maximum range of all attacks is 3 hexes. So no new enemies are going to spawn on point 3, but we do have this Blackout in effect for the rest of the combat, which is limiting our ranged effectiveness. So this battle is going to be a little bit more close quarters. And that goes there. Now, one of the reasons you have these cards out, it's a little reminder of who's coming from where. Because as you kill enemies, they go back into the pool and may come back as reinforcements later on. However, when you roll for reinforcements from a particular spawn point, you can never have more than you originally had come out of that spawn point. So when you kill enemies from a particular spawn point, you have to keep track that you killed them from there for when you roll the reinforcements later on. What I like to do, I like to take the dead enemies. This is a traitor guardsman with a flamer. So as I kill an enemy, I plop them on the card relating to the point they came out of. And then when I make my reinforcement rolls later on, I know exactly what the maximum number of enemies that can come back out of the reinforcement pool is. The final thing we have to do is set up our initiative deck. And for the initiative deck, you need to have 1 numbered card for each discovery token that has an enemy faction. So in this particular case, it's 1 and 2. And then you also need your initiative cards for the heroes involved. And those will be shuffled up, and we will be using those in a moment. So we now know we're going to be fighting those dastardly, treacherous traitor guardsmen. So we find out the traitor guardsman character card. And these are the stats that we'll be using for the combat. You can see that the card is very similar to the hero cards, except with slightly different stats and things. We have move here, we have wounds here, and we have size. Size is relevant because it determines how many of a miniature can be in a space at the same time. When it comes to small miniatures, you can get 3 in a space. They then have a series of weapon actions, and that is because when it comes to the enemies, Blackstone Fortress is WYSIWYG. It's what you see is what you get. So if the miniature has a flamer, then it can attack with a flamer. If the miniature has a lasgun, it attacks with a lasgun, and so on. There are some special rules and things like that. One of the special rules is relevant here because it determines the groups that you can deploy. Basically, if you have more than 5 traitor guardsmen in a group, one of them has to be a sergeant and one of them has to have a flamer. And sergeants are a little bit tougher, and flamers have ruddy great big flamers that cause no end of trouble for the heroes. And on the reverse of the cards, there are behaviour tables, and this is how the AI works for this game. We will deal with that in a moment. For now, we're going to deploy to the battlefield. We are deployed. It's a relatively simple process. You basically have to fill up the hex with the discovery token first, and then any leftover miniatures are deployed in adjacent hexes. The only stipulation being, if you can put the enemy in cover from the heroes, then you have to do it. So for example, these 3 guys here, these are behind this wall here, which does actually put them in cover from the heroes. I wouldn't have been able to have put them there because then they're not in cover anymore. Straightforward stuff. So yeah, so because they're small, we got 3 on each discovery token, and then the rest spilling into adjacent locations. With that done, we are ready to fight. And fighting happens in a series of rounds, going through the same steps each time. So first there is a destiny phase, then there's an initiative phase, then there's an activation phase, and then there's an event phase. So first of all, we have the destiny phase. In this phase, we roll our destiny dice. These are the ones that are on the precipice board. And what we do is we take out any doubles and trebles. So in this case, we take out those 5s. The dice that are left go to the precipice board and can be used as extra activation dice for the turn. So obviously, it's better to have unique results because it gives you more dice to work with. Once you've done that, you go to the initiative phase. In the initiative phase, first of all of the heroes roll their activation dice. And lay them out on the board, as we've already discussed, and then you have a specific initiative phase. Although a lot of the action is going to be happening on the battlefield on the main board, this combat tracker, it's almost like a little mini game, and it's a strategical element that's added to combat to give you more options and more interesting things that can happen. Because once you get to the initiative phase and everybody's rolled their activation dice, you have to determine the initiative order. And to do that, you take your stack of initiative cards and you give them a shuffle, and then the leader deals them from left to right on the initiative tracker. So we have Esbern, we have a hostile group, then we have Janus, then we have a hostile group, and then we have Thaddeus the Purifier, and then we have Pious Fawn. And by the way, I should point out that these are not the cards related to the miniatures that I put out on the board in the main battlefield. It's just for an example. Now, the way the initiative works is, as you can imagine, you go in initiative order. So first Esbern will activate, and then all of the hostiles from group 2 will activate, then Janus will activate, then hostile group 1, and so on. However, in the initiative phase, you have options as the heroes to manipulate events and to gain the upper hand in the battle. First of all, you can do something called covering fire. Now, if two heroes can see each other on the battlefield, then they can do covering fire, where one hero provides covering fire to an ally, and in that case you can actually rearrange your cards on the tracker, and that simply means you swap spaces. So say Esbern and Pious want to switch roles, they can provide covering fire, and they switch places on the initiative track. And obviously you can only do that with an ally, you can't change places with a hostile group. However, you do have a second option called a gambit. This will cost the hero that wants to move one of his activation dice, so you have to take an activation dice off of your character card. And then you make an agility test, and if you fail, nothing happens, you stay exactly where you are. If you get a success, then you can swap places with the closest enemy initiative card in the track. So, for example, if Thaddeus the Purifier got a success whilst trying to do a gambit, he would be able to swap places with hostile group 1. And if you get a critical success, if you roll 2 triangles on your dice, on your agility test, then you can swap places with any hostile group on the track, which is obviously much better. So that's how you can manipulate the initiative each time round to try and gain an advantage, get the upper hand on your enemies, and be extra heroic. During the activation phase, you work through the cards on the initiative tracker, activating the things in order. When you activate a hero, you have access to your activation dice to take actions plus destiny dice if they are available. And there are basic actions available to everybody, and then there are specific actions on the character cards. Basic actions are moving, which uses a dice with a value of 1 or more, and then allows you to move up to your movement characteristic. Bam, bam. Coming to get you guys. Then you have the recuperate action, which again requires a dice of 1+. When you do that, you get to make a vitality roll, and on a success you get 1 wound back, and on a critical success you get 2 wounds back, but you cannot recover grievous wounds in that manner. You can do a search action, which requires a dice of 4+. You can only do the search action if you are in the space with a discovery token, or you spend 3 inspiration points, which we'll get to in a moment. When you do that, so you spend your dice for 4+, and then you remove the token if you're searching at a token, or you don't if you're not, and then you get to draw the top card from the discovery deck, and that's how you're going to get your archaeotech and your clues. But you cannot do that if there are enemies breathing down your neck. If you're visible to enemies, you can't do it. So you need to kind of clear the enemies away from the discovery point. So again, the game is making you search in the places where the enemies are spawning. So it's forcing you into those combat situations, and it's forcing you to get stuck in. You can't hide around the corners too much. You have to get involved at some point. Then there is the summon action. The summon action also requires a dice with a value of 4+, and you have to be standing next to one of these, it's just off camera, portals. When you do that, you replace the portal with a maglev, and that is your extraction point for this particular mission. Once you have explored who you want to do, or you're getting really badly beaten up and you want to escape, you have to get to that maglev. You can't go back to the one you are leaving. You need to get out through the new extraction point. And in this particular map, both potential extraction points are behind this big clump of bad guys. So again, the game is forcing you, driving you constantly to get up in the grill of all these bad guys. So of course, a lot of the time, what you're going to be doing is fighting. You're going to be using your attack actions that are specific to your character on your character card. So let's take a look at how Janus Drake can beat up a traitor guardsman. So here we have the brave Janus Drake facing off against a traitor guardsman. And I think at this point I should make reference to the fact that yes, my miniatures aren't painted yet. Some of them are, but most of them are not. I have only recently started working my way through the Blackstone Fortress set. So when you purchase your set, you will indeed get red plastic heroes and grey plastic enemies, which is a nice thing because not only are the miniatures push fit and going together without glue, they are color coded to make it a little bit easier when you're playing the game. That aside, we want to talk about combat. And it should be noted for anybody who isn't aware of the history of Warhammer Quest, this activation dice system was first introduced in Silver Tower, and then a slightly more advanced iteration of it was introduced in Shadows over Hammerhal. And this version here in Blackstone Fortress is an iteration again, and I think is probably the most sophisticated version of that core mechanism to date. And it really does have some scope for interesting strategic play. But anyway, we are in a face-off situation with our traitor guardsman, and we have a choice of weapon options here. For Janus Drake, the only one that he can actually pull off at the moment is his 1+ pistol and a rapier attack, because he only has a 2, a 3, and a 3 on his activation dice, and his flurry of attacks requires either a 4+ or 6+. Now, potentially there might have been a Destiny dice available that he could use to activate that ability, but let's assume there isn't. Let's assume he's having an off day, and he's only going to be able to use his pistol and rapier. So we're going to discard our 2+ dice, and that's going to give us the chance to make our attack. When you make an attack, you have to check for line of sight first and foremost. Now, the white lines don't block line of sight, but they do provide cover, but you don't need to worry about that when you're determining line of sight. Line of sight is literally drawing a straight line from the center of your hex to the center of the enemy hex. If it doesn't touch any walls and things like that, you can see. And of course, your attack also has to be within the range of the gun. Most guns pretty much have unlimited range, so that's not a problem. But obviously the range does affect which particular dice you can roll. In this case, our traitor guardsman is 2 hexes away because you take the shortest path to the target. 1, 2. 2 hexes away. But we will be shooting along the line of this cover here. So our little traitor guardsman will be benefiting from cover. Cover, as you would imagine, actually makes it more difficult to injure a target, because when they're benefiting from cover, a success is treated as a failure and a critical success is only treated as a normal success. So you're very much limiting the damage output that you can put on your target. However, there is an extra ability available to all of our heroes called Aim, which requires any dice of value 1+. If you discard that at the same time that you make your attack action, so before you roll any attack dice, then you can ignore cover. Furthermore, there are certain weapons available in the game that also ignore cover. So let's assume we're discarding 2 dice so we can ignore cover for this particular roll. We know that our target is 2 spaces away, so we're going to be rolling one of the 8-sided dice. That is a critical success. So when you roll your dice, you have 3 potential results. You've got a fail, you have a success, which inflicts 1 wound, or you have a critical success, which causes a grievous wound. And a grievous wound for enemies equates to 3 wounds. So in this case, with one single shot, I have inflicted 3 wounds. Our traitor guardsman only has 2 wounds, so this attack would actually outright kill him. If I had rolled only a normal success, then I would have inflicted 1 wound, and the traitor guardsman would have still been in the fight. But because I had an activation dice left, I could have taken that activation dice and attacked him again, only this time I wouldn't have had the benefit of aim, so I would be having to deal with cover for that particular shot. And that is how the heroes are wounding the villains. Now let's assume a slightly different scenario. In this scenario, Janus wants to attack the traitor guardsman, but this sneaky sergeant has crept up behind him. And there is a rule in the game that you must always attack an adjacent enemy if you can. So in this particular case, Janus would actually be forced to fight this sneaky sergeant instead. Still dealing with cover, but the sergeant is a slightly tougher foe. And this could result in this particular guardsman surviving the fray, and getting a chance to shoot Janus Drake in the back. Because that's the kind of thing that a sneaky traitor guardsman would do. Finally, let's assume that Janus had a good day and he has cleared out all the enemies that are in his vicinity, and he still has 3 dice left at the end of his activation. When you reach the end of your activation phase, you don't want to do anything else. You don't want to waste your dice, and you don't have to. Because what you can do is you can turn those dice into Overwatch dice. What you do is you discard any dice with a value of 1. Any other dice degrade by 1 point. So 2s will become 1s, and your 3s will become 2s. Like so. And now those dice are available as Overwatch dice, and anybody who's played Space Hulk will kind of get the gist of how Overwatch works. If an enemy moves in front of you or attacks in front of you or pops from a reinforcement roll in front of you, you can discard one of these dice to make the relevant weapon action. You can only make 1 weapon action per triggering event, but it's an opportunity to get the drop on newly arriving enemies and keep the board a little bit more under control. The final thing that happens after you've done that is you have to make an inspiration roll. So you roll the black dice, this ominous 20-sided beast. You roll this dice and you compare the result to the number of wounds you inflicted on enemies during your activation. If you roll equal to or less than the number of wounds you inflicted, then you get an inspiration point. Inspiration points have a number of benefits. You can have a maximum of 4 at any one time, and you can spend 1 to re-roll an action dice. You can spend 2 to attempt a gambit during the initiative phase without spending an activation dice. You can spend 3 to take a search action even if there's no discovery token on your space, or you can spend 3 to flip your card to its inspired side, which obviously is like leveling up. So gaining inspiration points from killing enemies is a good thing to do. You want to be killing enemies, getting those inspiration points, because they're going to give you lots of additional benefits as you're playing through the game. So let's say Janus is done and the next card in the initiative track is a hostile group. The first thing you do is you have to make a reinforcement roll for that hostile group. And to do that, you roll the ominous Blackstone dice again. And if you roll a 4 or more, nothing happens. But if you roll a 3, a 2, or a 1, you may spawn additional enemies from the pool for that particular group, depending on the size of the monsters that are there. Huge monsters will only spawn on the roll of a 1, but as you get smaller monsters, they're going to spawn in greater quantities for the lower values on the dice. Once you've achieved that, you then have to activate each enemy that is in that particular hostile group. For each enemy, you roll the ominous Blackstone dice, and you compare the roll to where they are in relation to you on the board. So if they have no line of sight to an explorer, if they're adjacent to a visible explorer, if they're in cover, if they're close, or any other situation. This is very similar to the AI system used in Shadows over Hammerhall and Silver Tower, but again, it's an evolution and it's much more sophisticated, and the enemies should react a little bit more cleverly based on what's going on around them. You know, if they're in cover, they're more likely to take an aimed shot at you. If they're engaged with you, they're more likely to do an onslaught and really try and get at you. If they're well out of attack range, they're more likely to rush you. So the enemies will act a little bit more coherently based on the current state of play on the battlefield. So you roll the dice, you cross-reference, you do what it says. Most of the actions are standard actions available to all characters, all enemy characters, but anything in bold is a special unique action which is actually referenced on the card. So in this case, rush would be move towards the closest explorer and then take a charge action afterwards. I'm back. So at this point, they are then ready to make their attack, and like I say, it's a WYSIWYG game, so attacks are based on what the miniature has. In this case, our fella here would be using a las gun, and the attack is exactly the same as it was for Janus. Janus will benefit from cover. The las gun will be rolling 1 triangular dice. A blank on the dice is a miss, a triangle on the dice is a success, and 2 triangles is a critical success. In the case of heroes, they actually have a chance to block attacks. Each hero has their own defense value. In this case, Janus has a defense of 1 triangular dice. So the way it works is you roll the dice. If you get a success, then you can negate the wound, if it was a normal wound. If it was a grievous wound, it gets converted to a regular wound. If you get a critical success, then you can ignore the wound completely, whether it was a grievous wound or not. When it comes to actually applying the wounds, if you take a normal wound, you get a wound token, you place it on your character card. The next time you activate, you will only have 3 activation dice available to you. However, you can use vitality rolls to actually try and heal those wounds and get them removed again, so that next go round you will actually have your full complement of dice again. However, if it was a grievous wound, you have to place one of these down. Red side. And that cannot be healed. The only way you're going to get rid of that is returning to Precipice, ending the expedition, unless under very unique situations you may get an opportunity to remove a grievous wound. But under normal play, that's a persistent injury. That's a lingering arrow to the knee that's going to stick around until you finish your expedition. If at any point all of your boxes are filled up with wounds or grievous wounds, then it's nighty-night time, you take a nap, you are not involved for the rest of the conflict, and at the end of the combat, if the rest of the party escapes, then you have to make your rolls to see whether you actually come back or whether you die, and it's game over for everybody in terms of this particular expedition. And that's how the combat works. Once you've worked your way through all of the cards in the initiative track, there is finally an event phase, where again, one more time you roll the black dice, and you refer to an event table. In most cases, this is a generic event table that's available for all combat encounters. However, once you get to a stronghold or a special mission, there are sometimes unique event tables that you refer to instead. And those event tables will do things like remove discovery tokens from the board, add extra enemies, grant you inspiration. Good and bad things can happen. You might gain an extra discovery card as a lucky find. There's lots of different things that can happen. And once that event phase has been completed, then you start a new turn of combat. And combat will continue until all 4 heroes are out of action, or all of the remaining active heroes get to the extraction point and complete the combat in that way. And yeah, it's a really fun combat system. It's quite a lot of dice rolling involved. There's a lot of dice rolling for activating the different enemies. You have to roll the dice to see whether there's reinforcements, then you have to roll the dice for each individual model to see how it's going to act. You then have to roll for it to attack, you have to roll for your defenses. When you make your attacks, you're rolling your activation dice, and as you're spending dice, you're rolling the different action dice to see how those actions resolve. So there's a lot of dice rolling, but there's also quite a bit of mitigation involved. There's the aim action, things like that. Making use of cover, obviously. You want to be making sure that you're in cover, trying to encourage the enemies out of cover, using the AI to your advantage to lure them into positions where you can crossfire with your allies. There's a really interesting initiative mechanism where you can keep swapping out who's going to go next and things like that, which is really interesting. It's not just a case of, right, leader goes first and then just go around the table and everybody gets a go and then the bad guys act. It's much more dynamic than that. You might not get to act until all of the bad guys have moved, or it might be you get to act with one character, then the bad guys react. And trying to manipulate that initiative track into your favor, it's a very interesting mechanism that can really make the difference in a combat. And I really like the idea of this covering fire thing, where your allies are setting up corridors of fire so that you can achieve your objectives. You can really drill into the cooperative aspect of a unit fighting together, and this is why I say that this game feels much more like a unit being dropped behind enemy lines rather than a group of individual heroes who all have their own strengths. It's more of a team operation. It's like, okay, you set up covering fire there, you do covering fire for me, I'm going to go and grab that discovery token, and then we'll meet back at the extraction point and get out of here. It's really interesting, and I think it's a really nice evolution of the system that was originally seen in Silver Tower. I think they've done a really interesting job of taking it to the next level in terms of the extra elements that it provides. And I do find it fun. Yes, it can, if you've got a lot of guardsmen on the board or something and you're rolling your black dice over and over again for the activations, it can feel like it's taking a little bit too much time. But once you know what the results are for those dice, as you get familiar with the game, it really starts to pick up. It really starts to become much more fluid. And then really my only major complaint, like I say, is it's a bit of a nuisance setting up the map tiles each time. But there we go. It's a really interesting skirmish game with a lot to think about, and the idea of filling up your activation points with wounds and then having to try and get those wounds back under control, healing yourself up, keeping your activation dice being directly related to how many wounds you take. I particularly like games that link how effective you are with how many wounds you've taken. I've always found it's a little bit weird in games when it's like, I'm taking damage but I'm fine, I'm taking damage but I'm fine, I'm taking damage but I'm fine, now I'm dead. It's always seemed more natural to me that as you take wounds you become less combat effective, and then you have to fight to regain your combat effectiveness, and this particular system achieves that very well, and I like it a lot. So as I mentioned before, an expedition can end if a hero dies, or if you run out of exploration cards, or if you choose to get back out, or everybody gets defeated in a combat. And then when that happens, you return to Precipice. Returning to Precipice gives you the option to trade and get new items, but it also advances the game clock. So when you return to Precipice, the first thing that happens is you have to do a legacy step. And you get these legacy cards. And what you do is you take one of these legacy cards, you reveal it, and you apply its effect for the rest of your campaign. If at any point there are no legacy cards left, it's game over. You've taken too long and you've failed. And considering the base game campaign involves finding 4 strongholds and then making a raid on a hidden vault, you don't get a lot of wiggle room for returning to Precipice and taking things easy. You really are pressed for time all the time. The legacy cards themselves have a range of effects. Some of them are simply countdown clocks. These are the best result you can get, really. They just advance the game clock. They make it so that your deadline looms closer. But then there are events that can happen which affect you for the rest of the game, and potentially worst of all, there are 4 cards that add tougher enemies to your encounter deck. So once you draw these, you add the encounter cards for the relevant enemy to your encounter deck, and then you can face them. So you might get Chaos Beastmen, Chaos Space Marines, Obsidious Malaks, or the Rogue Psychers. And I like the choice of characters they've done here, because when you first start playing, you're only going to meet traitor guardsmen or things that kind of live in the Blackstone Fortress anyway. Urgles and spindle drones and things like that are native to the Blackstone Fortress. They were already there before anybody arrived. The Chaos Guardsmen, the traitor guardsmen, they're kind of like an advance force that are scouting the area before the arrival of their more elite brethren. So the Rogue Psychers and Obsidious Malaks is their leader, and obviously the Chaos Space Marines are their more elite units. So it's a really interesting representation of how the Chaos Forces are escalating their efforts to find the hidden vault before you do. And I like that a lot in terms of the legacy structure here. So you apply one of those, and after that you get to go trading. So in leader order, which basically means the leader gets to pick the order in which it happens, everybody gets to go to a spaceship of their choice. We have here the Vanguard, which was showing a support side, but all of the ships switch to their facilities side, and each ship has its own deck of resources which are specific to that ship and reflect the nature of the alien creatures on board that ship. This is an Imperial vessel. You draw 3 resources from the relevant deck, and this represents what is available to trade in that particular location. And let's say one of our heroes decides to go to the Vanguard. The first thing they can do is they have an option to use the special ability here, which does have a negative outcome. If you roll a 1, you lose an Archaeotech, but it actually has a really strong benefit if you achieve it, because on a 16+ you can take any discovery card from the deck of your choice. So you can actually use that to acquire clues or acquire the cards that give your heroes the inspiration and things like that. So that's really useful. And then you get to convert your Archaeotech, your spoils, into trading points. Let's say Janus acquired these 2 Archaeotech cards. You can see that each one is worth 1 point. So I decided to convert those well, I'm not going to convert them both into trading points. I'm going to convert one into a trading point so that I can purchase this Axlo Instinct Modulator. And like I've mentioned before, one of the interesting things about this game is a lot of the cards are discard after use. I do like that because it's something you can add and you have it for a while and then it might go. So yeah, it's something that you kind of have to keep going back to the shop and getting new stuff. So anyway, once all of the people have been trading and they've done their various bits and bobs, you have a choice of what you are going to do next. You either pause your game, in which case Games Workshop actually provided some nifty little plastic wallets that you put all your cards inside. So there's no bookkeeping or anything like that. You don't have to keep track of things on paper. You just put all of your cards in one of the grip seal bags and seal it shut, and then the next time you play, you just pull it all out. You've got 1 bag for each character that you're using and 1 bag for the mission itself, which holds the encounter cards and the legacy cards and things like that. So that's one option. Another option is to go on another regular expedition, as we have already explained. Or if you have acquired 4 clue tokens, you can discard your clue tokens to go on a stronghold raid. Stronghold raids work very similar to a normal expedition, except they have a short access route which only has a small amount of encounter cards in it, and then once you get through those encounter cards, there's actually maps in the back of the Precipice book, which I'm not going to show you because of spoilers, but they actually have maps with specific monsters out on the board, specific map related objectives like having to get to certain areas, activate terminals, things like that, their own special event tables, all that sort of stuff. And if you have achieved all 4 of the strongholds, then you can attempt to make the raid on the hidden vault, which is your overall objective. And if you get into the hidden vault and win, you've won, and you get to open this special sealed envelope which has bonus goodies in it, which you are only allowed to access once you've completed the campaign. And each expansion also comes with one of these cool little envelopes to give you extra bonus goodies as you complete different missions. And that's basically it. That is Blackstone Fortress. It's cyclical in nature. You will just keep going back into the Blackstone Fortress. You will keep finding new Archaeotech. You will trade it. You will buy better items. You will eventually find the clues and things that you need. You will tackle the strongholds. Eventually you will tackle the hidden vault, and hopefully you will do it before that deck of legacy cards runs out. And there really is a lot to like about Blackstone Fortress. It is not a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination. It does sometimes tend to veer on too easy if you've got really good equipment and you've really got your strategy sorted. A lot of the time you can really hammer the bad guys, especially if you catch them in crossfire. Even really big tough enemies you can take down with concentrated fire. It's not always like that. It can swing the other way as well. I'm finding it I'm not finding it easy, but I'm not finding it hard. There's loads of content in the base game. There's plenty to keep you going, and each expansion is introducing a new mission. I've talked about the expansions in previous videos, and maybe I'll do another video talking about how to incorporate those expansions into the base game another time. But this video is already humongously long. I guess that's all I've got to say for now. I hope people have found this interesting. Not just looking at the actual mechanisms of the game and how it plays out, but also getting more on my thoughts and feelings on the game in general. I do think sometimes it can stretch a little bit beyond what you're happy playing, in terms of having to keep rolling those dice and setting up the maps for the combats. It can get a little bit tiresome, but it is possible to pause your game at any point just using those grip seal bags. You can actually pause in the middle of an adventure if you really want to. The only time you can't pause is in the middle of a combat, because you can't preserve the battlefield and the position of all the miniatures on the battlefield. But as soon as a particular battle is over and you go back to that stage where you're going to draw an exploration card, you can put your exploration deck into a grip seal bag, and then the next time you want to play, you just take that out and just carry on playing from there. So yeah, the design of the game, it's really kind of countered for that potential to become a bit of a drag when games are running long. Sometimes if the dice aren't going your way and things keep respawning and you're just not getting those clue cards that you need, sometimes it is better just to go, right, I'm gonna pause for now because this is getting us nowhere, and we'll come back and deal with it another time. And it's nice that you can do that. I guess at this point it's over to you guys. Do you have any comments or questions? I've tried to cover everything, but there is a lot of small details in this game that it's when you're doing an overview like this, there's probably a few things that I've omitted to mention, or a few things that I have purposefully just not got into in any great detail, because the video is already a long video. But if there's any specific questions that you have, anything you would like to know more about, or anything where you feel like I'd like to expand on my views any further for you, do please leave your comments and queries, and I will do my best to respond to you. And otherwise, I guess I just have to say thank you very much for bearing with me. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope I will see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.